This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black Studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Michele Reid-Vazquez, who teaches in the Department of Africana Studies at Bowdoin College. Along with numerous scholarly articles, she is the author of The Year of the Lash, Free People of Color in Cuba and the 19th-Century Atlantic World, and is completing a manuscript tentatively entitled Black Mobilities in the Age of Revolution, Politics, Migration, and Freedom in the Caribbean. She is also the host of the podcast Dialogues in Afrolatinidad, a series exploring the history and culture of Black Latin America. In this conversation, we discuss the place of the hispanophone world in thinking the African diaspora, the varied notions and experiences of Blackness that comprise Black studies, and the complex relation between archival sources and the storytelling elements of writing history. Good afternoon, Michele. How are you doing?
Good, John. Good. Good to be here.
Well, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I was really happy that we found some time to talk for a lot of reasons. Just really interested in your research. I think it's incredibly important for the field. Also, as a scholar of Caribbean critical theory, it's just good to have somebody working on that part of the hemisphere. So as part of the podcast, we don't have enough. So I'm really excited to have you build up that part of the series, and just really interested to hear what you have to say about your own research, about the field of Black studies, and all of that. So thank you in advance for your time, but also for your thoughtfulness.
My pleasure. It's my pleasure to be here.
So we'll have a chance, of course, to talk, at some length about your research and about how you imagine the field of Black studies. But I wanted to start really with a more personal question to ask you about your own intellectual journey.
Mm-hmm.
What drew you to Black study, to the study of Black life? What drew you to Black studies? And for me, always this question of what sustains your interests.
So I would say my efforts to understand the nuances of Black life have been a really persistent feature in my life. Not always obvious, but ever present as I kind of think back over that. So I'd say it started with family stories about our Pan-Caribbean heritage, the racialized experiences of my parents and grandparents who grew up in the Jim Crow South. And one side has a really long line of educators. And that's, I think, where the seeds were planted to prioritize education, they encourage critical thinking, critical questioning, and thinking about Black people in America and beyond, and how to really make a better world. Kind of a each one teach one philosophy is what I grew up with. And so as an undergrad in Atlanta, I continued with my connection to African diasporic music making, where I studied classical and jazz piano and then voice along with Spanish. And then I did grad school in the Maryland, D.C. area, which opened up my musical exposure to jazz and Afro-Latin music. I also got to see a lot of the diversity of the African diaspora all around me in the D.C. area, African Americans, Ethiopians, Afro-Brazilians, Afro-Dominicans. And that environment made me realize I actually needed more than the musical creativity that I had kind of grown up with. I felt like I needed more of the social political context of the African diaspora, especially for the Caribbean and Latin America. So I wanted to understand race relations and the nuances of Black ethnicity, because I knew that Blackness was not a monolith, and I needed to really understand and kind of dig in to the research around all of that. And then I went on to do my doctoral studies in Texas, and that's where I was exposed to a lot of social theory, the historical canons in the U.S. and Latin American history, and wonderful classmates and scholars who became a part of this scholarly journey. And if it's okay, I'd like to mention just a few people because I don't know that they know.
I love names being on the podcast, so it's great.
But suddenly my advisors, Aline Helg, Tony Falola, Faye Iglesias, who was in Cuba, and then fellow Cubanists. We had this wonderful cohort, Matt Childs, Manuel Barcia, who not at Texas, but who was also in Havana, Karen Morrison, Andrew Rees-Singani, Mark McLeod. So questions of freedom and freedom within slavery was really kind of a core interest of mine. Race and gender relations, politics, migration, and identity. Those ultimately became kind of the central aspects of my work, especially for Cuba and the broader Caribbean. And I just highlight kind of some couple of key moments that came to mind as I was thinking about the questions. So first, I went on my first trip to Cuba to attend the Caribbean Historians Association conference, and it's there that I got to see for myself what Blackness looked like in Cuba. It was also a place where I could feel my ancestors, and I could walk in the spaces of some of the people I had been doing the research and writing about, and so that really made a profound impact. And then I said the second kind of major piece was I was doing my doctoral research abroad in Spain. And I remember meeting with the archive director, and she told me, we don't have anything on Cuban slavery. I just went, and people had said, like, people had prepared me for that. So I knew that comment was coming. And I said, well, no, you've got several collections. And, I listed a few, and I said, there's also one called Cuban Papers. So, like, I can just start with that, and we'll see what happens. And I think what happened, what the reality is that there was a split in the archive. So they go up to maybe early 19th century, and then the rest are in a different archive. So, but I was like, no, but I'm here for this. I'm in the right place. And so while I was there, I met a woman named Asma Burha. She's a Moroccan-born researcher who showed me how to navigate and find Blackness in the archive. So she lived there. She was an independent researcher. She did work for folks remotely. And she's like, come with me. let me show you where you can really find it. Because things aren't labeled. There's nothing about Blackness. There's nothing. You might find esclavitud or slavery, but nothing. There's no freedom within slavery. It's not broken down that way. And so, with her help, we sadly found a lot of information that ended up in folders marked miscellaneous. And that really struck me. And so I think that's when I recognized that the importance of the work that I was doing to bring African diasporic voices to the surface. And I just continue to do that in my scholarship and my teaching.
Yeah, I didn't mention in the, sort of welcome to the podcast piece, but you are a University of Maryland graduate at the master's level. So
yes,
which is amazing. And as you said, I mean, there is something about the DMV, DC, greater DC area, just as you said, just the very idea of what Black people means in this kind of space is so interesting. But what really stuck out for me in you telling that is the transition from music and musical practice, and which is about influence and performance and finding those kind of creative energies and expressive traditions, to archival work.
Yeah,
that's a you sort of said, I did that and then I did this. That's a really interesting. I don't want to call it a leap, but that's an interesting transition. Right. To it's not just study, but it's sort of like the most study of study, right? Which is the archives.
Well, I think I have been an historian. I just didn't know it. And so I was really fortunate while I was there. So I mentioned Alina Hill because she was really instrumental in helping me understand that I am a historian. So we would talk. I think we had an independent study, and at the end of it, because I was interested in the 20th century, but I kept saying, "Oh, but this is really fascinating. This stuff that's happening here at the end of the 19th. Oh, wait, there's other stuff regarding race that's happening in the middle of the 19th century. Oh, wait, and I just kept going back further and further." She said, "That is how a historian thinks. That you have to, the answers are found in the past to understand the present." I said, "Well, doesn't everybody think that way?" She's like, "No, that is not as common as you might like to think." And so I was like, "Oh, okay." But I think I wanted, I don't know if it's something more tangible, because for me, the musical part, it activates a different part of my brain. And so I really wanted to understand how you take a text. And again, a lot of this for me had been really instinctual. So my mom is a librarian, a retired librarian. So I would read like everything. She would write memos or whatever it was, and then she'd say, "Look at this. What do you think?" And I would give this commentary. So I don't know. So I think for me, in a lot of ways, that was already archival material I was looking at. and giving commentary about it. And then, so for me, I think it's always been there. I just had to tap into it. And then moving in, so when I remember even taking my first classes in history, and so the concern was, oh, we have to show her, it's not just this book, or this historical book, but it's also, what does the historical book mean in the context of the time period that you're talking about? And I was like, oh, okay, this is what I actually have to do. So I don't know, I felt like it was a fairly easy transition, but in the process, I did put down my musical studies completely to really focus on. I'm like, this is a whole other discipline. I really need to take the time and understand exactly what I'm doing, learn about what it means to be in the archive, the politics of the archive, the communications and networks you have to make to be able to work successfully in some archives. They're not all the same. I worked in Cuban archives. That is a very different animal than working in the Spanish archives, which is very different from working in the British archives, working in American archives. I was like, this is the most luxurious space I've ever been in. It is in an American archive. So, and they all work so differently. Some are really social. Some are like, we will leave you alone and no one will come talk to you unless you can find your way up to the counter to do whatever it is you need to do. So it's been very eye-opening. And also the gatekeeping of it is also really not surprising, but you have to learn how to navigate the gatekeeping, even the hazing that happens within the archival spaces. It's quite a it's quite a challenge. Yeah.
Hazing in the archives is a really great essay title. You should write
Yeah.
that piece.
Oh,
I like that idea.
that's an interesting piece. But yeah, I've got a great story about that I can add into that kind of essay. But yeah, but the music. So I put the music down for a long time because I needed to learn, and I found that I really loved history. It was a surprise for me because growing up, again, having a mother who as a librarian gave me access to books, all kinds of books, I knew full well that the history I was learning in school was not the complete history. It's particularly for Black people and particularly for issues of freedom within slavery. And I was just like, well, why are they teaching me this when the reality, and this is not the reality, or it's not the full reality? And so I really was like, I could be bothered. I could care less about history. By the time I finished high school, I was like, no, thanks. So I don't think I took any, I don't know if it was required in undergrad, but I took none of it. And then somewhere in there, as I finished college, trying to figure out what is it I want to do, I think that's when I started to think about more the historical study, or at least I wanted to get a sense of what the histories were for the Caribbean and Latin America in a deeper way. And that's when I just remember lots and lots and lots of tears of all the books I read about all the tragic, horrific stories. And at the end, I was like, okay, I'm ready. Let's go find out what else these people have to say about the world that they live in.
I mean, first of all, that has to be so gratifying to your librarian mother for you to turn into, the sort of other iteration of librarian, the manager of information. I absolutely love that. My sister is a librarian. She's actually a former president of the American Library Association.
Oh,
wow. And is her wife is an historian, so it's a kinship here. But I love that just that's a great continuum story, right? Of somebody surrounded by books and the sort of archive of books to the archive of history and memory. But also, I just want to say it because I think mentorship is such an interesting and complicated category. And it was the way you talked about that mentorship moment was not sort of, I think, how we typically think of mentorship, which is support people for who they are. Mm-hmm. But that other mentorship moment, because I've had similar in my own career, where somebody actually sees you in a way that you can't see yourself and puts you on the right path. I love those moments of mentorship because that's a hard thing to say to somebody. You're actually an historian, you're not a musician, right? So, sort of push somebody in a direction. So I just really love that part of the story, just commenting on it.
Yeah, and I think I take that with me as I work with students. I just try to see them from where they are, and I think probably with all of them at a certain point, I can see the possibilities. And so at some point in our relationship, I'll sit down with them and say, listen, have you thought about, like, what are you thinking about? Well, have you thought about X, Y, and Z? Because I'm, I've just noticed the tendencies, the trends, the way you think about things, and just you don't have to do anything with it, but I want you to know that I've been thinking about, what you might do and how you might use your talents. And so it's been really gratifying to see my former students go out and take on the world, and be so excited about all the things that they're doing.
Professor Burke, spring quarter 1990, I'm leaving his office, and he says, "You're pretty good at this stuff." I can trace everything back to that moment, right?
Wow.
I didn't think I was very good at it. I don't even know that I was, but he said whether it was true or a lie, it changed my entire trajectory. So, no, those these things that stick with me as an educator too is massive impact that moment can have
Hmm.
of seeing something that somebody may not see about themselves. And so I love that. Um, Let me cast a sort of broader question about the field of Black studies and how you think about it, how it functions in your intellectual imagination. And I want to ask that about that portrait that you work with from the perspective of its own founding and history, which was, the late 1960s, early 1970s, where there were conflicting demands or demands that were in tension with each other. One was the demand to have a place in higher ed where you could study Black life and Black intellectual traditions, expressive traditions, something that the disciplines had failed to do. And this was what the founding of Black studies was going to make possible and has made possible.
Hmm.
And so that commitment to the intellectual tradition is part of the founding of the field. But that was, of course, also at a time where post-civil rights, Black liberation struggle had really radicalized and pushed a lot of boundaries and even just broken down the boundaries between study and activism, between campuses and communities, between intellectual life and interventionist and prescriptive politics. And so I think that the field of Black studies still has this tension in its conversation about itself, which is, what is the place of a certain kind of politics? What is the place of a certain kind of intellectual inquiry? So I'm interested to hear you talk about your portrait of Black studies that you work with and thinking of it, at least partly in terms of its founding and our inheritance of those tensions and principles.
Well, I mean, I think you put it really well, kind of the just to examine the experiences of African and African diasporic people across time and place. And for me, the really important piece is that interdisciplinary approach, and I'll say more about that in a minute. I think because of that, I think it's so important that you need this kind of multi-pronged approach to hold and frame the dynamics, the creativity, the struggles, analytical perspectives, innovations. And so in the academy and in society, it's significant because of the way that the U.S. and other parts of the world in the past and present have worked to diminish Black people. And so in terms of the political impact, for me, it's actually really hard to separate the intellectual, expressive, and intellectual and political position. I think they're both political within themselves. And so I have to consider, that a call to action can take many forms, especially given the different perspectives of Black studies that it pulls from. So I'm thinking about from the perspectives of, at least pulling from my work to start with, perspectives on Haitian immigrant mothers in the early 19th century Jamaica, who refused to be recast as slaves in the British colony and who refuted false narratives that negated their children's status as citizen subjects just because their offspring protested the second-class status of Afro-Jamaicans. So this I found to be a social political stance against racism and anti-Blackness. Then I think about Arturo Schomburg, Afro-Puerto Rican bibliophile, whose collections, materials on Africa and the African diaspora in the early 20th century helped to establish the Center for Research in Black Culture at the New York Public Library. So his act of collecting evidence on the Black experience was transgressive and certainly political in the work that he was doing. To kind of the 2021 protest song, Patria y Vida, Homeland and Life by Afro-Cuban artists, and the groups Orishas, Gente de Zona, and other folks on the island that called out the government for its errors and on the ongoing societal problems. So that's art and politics. So for me, the field of Black studies is about understanding the African diaspora and the continent from a global perspective, whether it's, in Africa, in in China, in Europe, in India, in the Americas, and the intersecting roles of politics and culture and race and resistance and forging these realities. So Black Studies then gathers, it codes, it breaks down this information so everyone, at least I think more increasingly for everyone, to understand that issues like anti-Blackness and structural racism erode paths to freedom. Black Studies also shows us that because these processes are always in motion, um, and that choosing to foster joy and support and rest and creativity are all critical elements in understanding Black experiences. So that politics, that political, for me, there's not a either or, that the intellectual and creative and political are all mingled together. And I think that's why that's one of the things I love about Black studies is that interdisciplinarity of it, to be able to hold all of these pieces and not just say, oh, we're not going to talk about culture, we're only going to talk about history, or we're not only going to talk about creative expression. Like, no, it's all in there together. We get to pick and choose where we want to focus, but it's not the rest of it. The context doesn't go away.
Yeah, I think this, as you were saying, there's nothing more political than asserting the meaning and value of Black culture. I mean, it's a weird question to ask, the cleavage between intellectual inquiry and political activism in 2025. I mean, we're talking on February 18th. We're like fourth week into a far right government, and I was read over the weekend, like so many other people, the Department of Education's advisory was plainly not going to stand up, but I mean, it's an intimidation letter.
Mm-hmm.
But they weren't just targeting activists on campus. They actually were targeting social life, right, in any kind of inquiry. So it was inquiry in social life that was, quote, exclusive around race. And I think that, for me, it was a reminder of so much of what you were saying, that this work is already political, even though in our, inside Black studies, we may say, well, here are people who are working on sort of direct action, and here are people who are working on literature in the 19th century. But in that broader scope, it's really hard to hold that up, I think. And I like the way you put it. Like, it's a reminder of it's not a reminder, it's a way of seeing that entire history. You mentioned Schomburg. It's like that was a massive political intervention. It's not just a collection that we can go use for our research. It's a massive political statement.
Yeah, absolutely.
So all that is to just repeat what you said, because I really love that. I love the way you put that. Well, let me ask about your own research a little bit in relation to Black studies. You've talked about it a bit, about your use of historical methods and cultural theory, and of course archival work, and focusing on the Caribbean and Afro-Latino questions of history and identity and expressive culture. So I'm interested in that collage of the things you work with and the themes you work on, how you see your work fitting into the history of Black studies, but also what boundaries do you think it pushes? What new horizons do you think it's opening up in the field?
So, yes, a really good question. I had to kind of marinate over this one. I think it connects to telling the historical stories of African diasporic people. For me, that's primarily been Spanish-speaking Caribbean and Latin America. And the way that Black studies in its opening decades worked to render the lives of Black Americans and Africans more visible in the scholarship. So my work does that for regions that are geographically outside the U.S. And Africa, but that are also intricately connected to the U.S. through American imperialism and all the processes of racism and sexism and economic exploitation and political dominance wrapped up in all of that. You asked me about new horizons. I think for me that it really remains wide open. And I think in my early days, I remember reviewing the historiography of colonial race and gender relations and issues of race and freedom. And there was and remains far more scholarship on the U.S. than on the Caribbean and Latin America. And that's, I think, what really anchored me. I think it's part of the reason why I'm so passionate about raising awareness about Black Latinxes. Afro-Latin college students are on the rise in U.S. universities and across the country. But the general public and students and even some academic professionals still really grapple with the disconnect our society has created by constructing a Latinx category that excludes Blackness. So I'm now using my scholarly podcast, Dialogues in Afrolatinidad. I hope it's okay to plug that a little bit. But
Please do. Absolutely. It's a great podcast.
Thank you. But I'm using it to explore the nuances of Afrolatinidad with experts and artists and the connected transnational issues like the importance of representation. So from complex portrayals in the media to being counted in the census, to the significance of education as a liberatory tool to challenge Afro-Latinx invisibility in the curriculum, and to raise awareness about issues that Afro-Latinx are experiencing as youth and in college and in the workforce, to personal identity in the form of mental health and well-being that fosters Blackness as a positive attribute that acknowledges that external and family microaggressions are not okay. And perhaps my favorite part of the podcast is to showcase the work of my colleagues in the Black Studies arena. So historians and dancers and sociologists and musicians and anthropologists and political scientists and community organizers, that I can then share this with the public, and then that seeps its way back into college classrooms. Let's see. Did you ask me about expanding elements in the field? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah.
I mean, you're sort of speaking to it well, but by the way, you feel free to plug the podcast, but also, if it's okay, we are going to be scraping a lot of your guests into the Black Studies podcast. So
okay.
That's a great resource that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're wonderful. They're fantastic. I see the work that I do both in the historical realm and this contemporary public space of the digital Black humanities as a contribution to understanding Black diasporic experiences and identities within the Caribbean and in Afro-Latinx communities in the U.S., analyzing strategic and layered approaches in their struggles for social and racial equality, and prioritizing Black identity in the past and the present, and providing a public educational forum or platform to make the work that we do in Afro-Latinidad studies more accessible to the public. So I think all of those contribute as far as for the work that I do to Black studies, and I think hopefully it just continues to expand the work of Black studies, the field of Black studies.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking about this just yesterday with Marlena Dowd, who was talking about Caribbean studies, but especially about Hispanophone Caribbean Black studies sort of connection, and we were talking about just how underrepresented that is, how new that was just even 10 years ago to the field of Black studies. I think increasingly it just is understood as something you need if you're forming a Black studies department. You can't just do U.S., maybe parts of Africa, maybe parts of the Caribbean that are Francophone and Anglophone or sort of familiar. So I think I do think that boundary has been pushed in so many by so many people that it is really reshaping the field. But it is like really striking how it's had to be reshaped that way. You use the words, you refer to the census. I've thought this for a long time because I think this area that you research is incredibly important to think about. Just to begin with, to be thinking about Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Cuba as part of the African diaspora. And I'll just say my former colleague at Amherst College, Solsi Del Moral, really, I think, I learned so much from being her colleague and from her work around just phrasing that, right? That this is as part of the African diaspora, and this is a forgotten part of Black studies. But you mentioned the census, but the census has been already saying that, right? If you click Black on the census, then it turns you to Hispanic, non-Hispanic. And so there's kind of funny way that like it's like the census was working with this category in ways that Black Studies wasn't.
Mm.
I don't know that there's anything deep there, but it's a thing that struck me like why did it take Black Studies so long to come to this? And it really, especially when you mentioned Schomburg. I mean, it's not
Mhm.
as if Black Studies, I mean, that's the mecca of Black Studies research. He himself,
Mhm.
Afro-Latino.
Yeah, I'll just say the census is changing, or at least they're trying to change it to disaggregate rate to basically to conflate Latino as race and ethnicity. And so there's been a big campaign. I know the Afro-Latino Forum did a big campaign. Latino is not a race to try to because they want to be able to capture that racial component because it's not the same as ethnicity. And then also there's some of the categories like the way they would say, oh, you can check Black if you are um, if you are from or origin from Jamaica, Haiti, like, all these Caribbean places, but not Cuba, not, not Dominican Republic, things like that. And so not Colombia, so this just interesting, like why are those not read as Black? So we'll have to see. I'm not quite up on all the particulars of it, but the last I heard, the census was conflating race and ethnicity for Latinos. So we'll see what
I'm really
happens.
not excited about this current administration's take on the census and race, but so we take a
Yeah.
long window here. So we don't have video, but yeah, I think I just gave you a migraine. Sorry about
That's
that.
okay. That's okay. One thing at a time. One thing at a time.
Yes, yes. Well, let me ask another question about your research, and in some ways another question about your own intellectual journey, which is your PhD was in history, which is a disciplinary doctoral education, but your research and interests, as you've talked about, are so embedded in the field of Black studies and other areas studies, Latin American studies, Caribbean studies, and so on. And so, I'm interested in how you think that that movement between a disciplinary training and inter or multidisciplinary work in fields, in terms of your employment, professional organizations, interests, and all of that, how you think that's impacted how you conceive and do research projects, but also how you do and conceive classrooms.
Mm, okay. I'll just say I think I've always been interdisciplinary, even when I didn't know what that was. So, um, my undergrad days in classical music and language, and then graduate training in jazz, voice, and ethnomusicology, and then I started actually my graduate training, my PhD training in anthropology, and then I shifted into history from there. So, at the beginning of my grad career, I was a huge fan of history because I thought it gave me this massive framework to study whatever I wanted that connected with that Black diasporic experience. I was especially interested in understanding social constructions of race in Latin America, and analyzing historical texts that allowed me to see these developments and transitions more clearly. And as I said, Aline Held, I think was, credit her with really seeing that ability in me and helping me to refine those skills. Um, and then over time, I think I began to realize a couple of things. First, that the archives only emphasis of history was in some ways keeping me from seeing other relevant methodological approaches for examining the Black experience. And then second, that some of the traditional history departments and institutions that I've been at deprioritize what I studied. So they deprioritize the Caribbean and Latin America and African diaspora. And so doing my work in those spaces was ultimately untenable. But when I finally switched to a Black Studies department, it was really eye-opening. I was like, this is what's happening over here. Like I don't have to explain
Right.
myself. Um, and so at times I was really kicking myself for not taking more Africana Studies courses beyond those that I had done for music and language as an undergrad. But I was excited to be in a space that centered Black experiences and regions and histories. And I especially count myself fortunate to have been in a department that prioritized transnational Blackness. So when we were teaching, students could learn more explicitly about the connections among African Americans and then Black folks in the Caribbean and Latin America and Europe, and of course on the continent. Um, let's see. Um, my training. I'm just trying to think back a little bit more to my training. So I say the disciplinary training in history has been a great anchor. but the interdisciplinary focus has allowed me to really, I think, has really enriched the work that I do. So it allows me to bring my whole self to the work I do. So I'm a scholar, I'm a musician, I'm a podcaster on Afrolatinidad. And so I try to offer a fuller picture of the complexities and pluralities of Blackness. So, for example, I'm working on a book project now. In some of the writing sessions, I'm gathering, I'm analyzing council records and newspaper articles and interrogation documents, but also poetry and songs and ideological influences from enslaved and free Black populations, which is, I'd say, in a lot of ways, what I've always done to a certain extent in the work that I do. But over time, I've been able to see it more clearly. But I've also been able to see the way that my beloved historians look at my work and go, "What is this?" And so it's been interesting. I'm like, it's the same thing it always was, but there's more. There's more pieces to it now that aren't from the archive, or even if they are from the archive, they're not read that same way. So I'm just like, so I'm just like, you know what? That's okay if you don't understand it. Some other people will understand it, and you can come back around to it when you're ready. It's not. I'm not mad at you. It's okay. I would also say I'm singing. I know. Well, it's just one of those things where you realize that sometimes the things that you're prioritizing in your work, other people aren't prioritizing anymore or don't see it as valid, and I'm just like I'm too deep in my career to look around and say, oh, I shouldn't be doing it this way. That's just not going to happen. Like I do the work that I do because I love the way that I do it. I love the subjects that I work on. And honestly, I feel a calling from the archival voices to tell these stories the way that the subjects want to have it told, from the material that I can gather, the scattered material that I can gather, to tell those stories. And I need to honor them that way. So it is my honor to tell about the voices from the late 18th and early to mid 19th century and what's going on in these spaces and the forgotten stories. And so if it requires that I use a variety of different ways to do that, lenses to do that, then that's what I will do. And so that's what I love about it, that I can see all those elements in it, because they were complex individuals, human beings, and I want to show that complexity as much as I can. I will also say that because I'm singing again, something, as I mentioned before, I stopped doing in order to study history, that I'm now able to incorporate all that I know as a scholar and all that I know as an artist into this creative space, this analytical space. And so, and then of course the podcasting and all the extension of that. So it's been this kind of, I won't say whirlwind, but in a lot of ways, I mean, I know my family was like, "What are you doing? You're bouncing around." I got landed in history. But before that, I was in anthropology for a little while, and I just needed, and I contemplated sociology. Like, it was just, I needed all of them, all the methods to think about how I wanted to make these approaches. Like I love data. Have always been interested in the census and the work, but I just don't. I use it, but I just don't make it as explicit. So I'm just trying to use all the material that's available out there to give the fullest picture of the dynamic lives of Afro-diasporic populations that I work with. And so, love it, hate it, I don't know, but for me, like, that's the way I have to do this work. That's the way I understand the work that I do and the contributions that I make.
Yeah, I mean, my PhD was in philosophy, and I spent early career time in philosophy departments. And, it just really resonated with me when you said, this moment when you moved to a Black Studies department, you were like, oh, I don't have to explain all of these things, or I don't have to justify all of these things. I mean, I remember being in a Black Studies department, my first one at Amherst College. And I was like, all I really have to justify is the importance of critical theory, which is easy. In philosophy departments, trying to justify how this text is philosophy or why Black people should be taken seriously as philosophers, I was like, yeah, I just can't fight that. That's just demoralizing. Fight for critical theory. I mean, it was never a fight, but like, explain that. It's just a whole different question. But also, when you start to talk about, all these methods, all these things come in that the composite and accumulative nature of Black Studies research is both its beauty, but also its difficulty. I think there's really something to be said about the demand that we put on ourselves once we step outside of disciplines. I think it's a wonderful thing, but it's also you have to love reading because you're going to read a lot of different kinds of books. You
Yeah.
could be reading novels and poetry as well as archival materials, listening to music and learning how to listen differently and all of that. So I really love you give really great testimony to that, that beauty of the immense, material that Black Studies has to work with, and you can't really escape it. But also, we get to carve out our niches, right? We get to carve out like what becomes important in music, and hearing what you said about being a singer. So maybe we'll have to check in with you soon and have you back on the podcast as an artist. Because we have a separate artist podcast and sort of relationship and study to that. So
great.
Well, yeah, and maybe we professors never really succeed in the performing arts. So here's your chance to do us proud out there. Get a good contract or something like that.
I was gonna say, lower your expectations. It really just beginning. I mean, I do love it. In fact, I performed last fall for the first time in like on a stage with hundreds of people there. Like that was really amazing. But also I just remember thinking, oh, I have there's so much more work I need to do in order to make this exactly what the kind of experience that I would love, that I want it to be. It was one of those things where I was like, just hold it together, breathe.
I can't imagine being on a stage in front of hundreds of people. So,
well, you can't actually see all the people. But you can feel the energy, and that's what I felt.
Yeah.
And they were wonderful. They were there for everything. It wasn't just me singing. There were lots of musicians doing lots of different things, but it was really this wonderful feeling of telling stories another way, in this musical kind of way. And so, and I was able to tell a little bit about the history of the musicians. And I was like, okay, this is great, but I need more time for this to develop. Like this can't be. I'm going to need some time to think about what I really want to say with this. What musicians I want to highlight. I've been very interested lately in social protest music. That's I mentioned the Pancho y Vida song, and then there's Bad Bunny has a new song out about Hawaii and Puerto Rico and not becoming like Hawaii, I'm just trying to think about I guess that cross of art and politics I'm drawn to. So I'm just trying to figure out what it is, and of course, then my historical brain goes, well, how far back am I going to need to go in the 19th century? But I'm excited about, well, let's see what I find out. I don't know where it's going to lead me, but I'm looking forward to connecting with more musicians and who are trying to explore these avenues, and just, and we'll see what happens. But I'm trying to think more about my work connecting with broader publics. I mean, I think from the traditions, especially the disciplinary traditions of you write for 5 people, for the 5 scholars out there who are going to read your work. But it's increasingly become important. Well, it's been important to know that people are out there in the general public saying, hey, we want to know about this. We're not going to read a book about it. We probably won't read an article, but we'll listen to a podcast. We might go to a webinar. We'll listen, if there's a video, if there's music, if there's someone we can access this whenever we're ready to get to it, then absolutely. And I just thought, okay, let's lean into that kind of digital public sphere platform and see where that goes. Because I'm always interested in using it as a learning tool. Like I use it with my students, and they've been. And in fact, I asked them. I said, "Do you guys want to hear these podcasts?" If these aren't working for you, then let's do something else. They're like, "No," because I have them listen to the scholars that they're going to be reading about, and so they get to not just hear the author speaking, but also speaking about their life and their work and the significance of the article. And so that they said, "Yeah, that's pretty powerful." If I can't bring the person to them, then this is the next best thing. And the The same way with films. I mean, I'm like, I want to take you all to the Caribbean, to Cuba, to the center of of my universe. But since I can't, we're going to watch some videos, and we'll let your minds, be blown a little bit by this excursion into the documentary. So that those are ways those I mean, and also those are the ways that I'm trying to teach and get those messages out there and have people become exposed to things that they wouldn't necessarily get exposed to in their traditional courses, I guess.
And I love that as, thinking about music. By the way, just I'm absolutely here for plugging the new Bad Bunny album, which is so good. It just is so good. I did not expect it, um, but I love the way you were talking about music as not just expressive, and that's plenty, but also not just political, also political, but intellectual work. And I really that makes me really happy. So I just saying that as an aside, because I love these moments of being reminded that expressive culture does intellectual work. It doesn't just do political work, and it doesn't just do sort of mirror of people to each other, right? I think
Right.
that sense of intellectual work, I really love that. And I like that you get to be in front of hundreds of people rather than 3 of those 5 people who read our books, which is usually the conference experience. Well,
Yes.
let me ask you a couple of final questions. One about thinking about the field of Black studies historically and in the present. What do you think that Black studies in its 5+ decades, what do you think Black studies has done well, but what do you also think it hasn't done particularly well?
So I think I go back to my biggest piece is that is interdisciplinary. Um, I think being interdisciplinary is a superpower, and I think that's something that Black Studies really does well. Despite given, as you pointed out earlier, the problematic elements of having these multiple methods, I think it's also one of the best things about it. So the ability of scholars to pull from a variety of research methods, so archival, ethnographic, literary, statistical, digital humanities, all of this and more adds to the understanding of the richness and nuances of Black life. And I'm thinking about folks whose work I've come into contact with more recently in Black studies, like Sadia Hartman and critical fabulation, to fill in the gaps in the historical record of African diasporic peoples, of Jessica Marie Johnson and her use of data sets and Black digital practice to uncover new knowledge and pathways to justice. And I think also I'd say the second element would be teaching Black studies. So the field has expanded exponentially since its inception. In the first department in 1968 in San Francisco State. Today, I was just reading through. I like data, so I was like, so there are over 360 departments, 20 PhD programs in Africana Studies in the U.S., and then Black Studies programs are offered in 1,300 universities around the world. There's a new AP course for high school students. Plus, there's a National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institutes that support professional development of K through 12 and college teachers. And a lot of them have Black studies topics as their focus. So I think that interdisciplinary piece and then the educational piece have been really something that Black studies really does well. What they don't do well, and I've alluded to this earlier, I think they don't. Black studies does not do Afro-Latin American and Afro-Latinx studies well. So that's my main critique. They continue both these areas, Afro-Latin America, U.S. Afro-Latinx, continue to be secondary, maybe tertiary studies outside of the focus of U.S. and Africa. Even though the largest African diaspora in the Americas is in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I've had to say that to my colleagues in my department on a couple of occasions, just to remind them. I mean, and I think the point at that time was that Black Studies was created in the U.S. I'm like, but it's about the global Black experience. So please remember, 160 million people of African descent in Latin America. There's another 60 million adult Afro-Latinos here in the U.S. Sorry, not 60, 6 million. Let me get that right. And I'm not saying that it hasn't changed over the years, because you mentioned earlier there are more positions that have come at. And I credit scholars who kind of paved the way, folks like Ben Vinson, who's a specialist in the history of Afro-Mexico, He headed up one of the first centers for one of the centers for Africana Studies at Johns Hopkins. He's now president of Howard. Cultural anthropologist Kia Caldwell, her research on her field research on Black women in Brazil. Sociologist Nancy Lopez, who's a lead researcher on the recent UCLA report called Centering Afrolatinidad. And certainly had a legal scholar, Tanya Hernandez, whose most recent work examines anti-Blackness in the Latinx community. I think institutions are doing better. As you said, there are more jobs opportunities for folks who focus on Afro-Latin America and Afro-Latinx communities and issues, but there's still some resistance, I think, to it.
Yeah.
I would encourage departments, all y'all out there, departments, to create more space, at the very least, for scholars who do transnational or hemispheric work that links Afro-Latinxs in the U.S. to Afro-Latin Americans, to African Americans. I think it's really important work, and I think you'd be surprised in a lot of ways at how many of those kind of pressing issues happening here are also affecting folks in Latin America and the Caribbean. I just think it's important that like there should not be silos in that hemispheric diasporic situation. We should all be thinking about, there's policing and surveillance and migration, and there's just a litany of things, health disparities and racial disparity. I mean, there's a whole thing, and they're all affecting all of us across the hemisphere, and that we should pay more attention to those connections.
I mean, I couldn't have put it better. I agree. So, I mean, as a Caribbean specialist, Francophone Caribbean specialist, it's just been really strange for me to spend so much time in Black studies where the Caribbean is such a small part. And I understand the U.S. founding of departments, but, that initial wave of Black studies was fascinated with Pan-Africanism. And if Pan-Africanism does not include Latin America, Caribbean, I don't quite know how to make sense of the Pan in that. And hopefully that's moving. I mean, I think that the idea of Afrolatinidad as part of Black studies, that has shifted over the last 10, 12 years. But there's a difference between shifting the imagination and hiring, as you're pointing out. And that's that in ages of scarcity, people tend to fall back on, the most familiar, and here they're replacing someone who worked on the Harlem Renaissance or something like that.
Right.
So what we really need are more positions in Black studies, not just working with our scarcity.
Yes, we do.
Well, maybe this is, you've already gotten a ways towards this response to this final question I wanted to ask you, which is, in the context of Black studies, what is the issue that you think we should all be thinking about, or the question that we should all be asking?
Well, I have lots of questions about.
I don't think anybody's had one question. I think everybody's like, well, I have a few.
Yes. So I think kind of coming back from what I was saying earlier, we need to do a better job of connecting African diaspora communities in the Americas. Whether it's through digital platforms like this or collaborative kinds of projects. How can we count these groups in the Americas in ways that acknowledge Black identity and ethnicity, and that provide access to resources? How can we continue to use our platforms to foster dialogue and policy solutions that build ecosystems that address common issues across the African diaspora? As I said before, over-policing, anti-Blackness, immigration, to environmental, racial, and gender disparities. And finally, how can we better educate the youth, K through 12, college teachers, and the public about global Black communities and their ongoing contributions to society? So,
I love that. That's, this has been a fantastic conversation. I was really looking forward to it, and you've raised a lot of questions, and that's really a pointed sort of place to wrap up. I just think that puts the challenges of what Black studies has always been, which is expansive ideas of Africa and its diasporic people, and bringing it back to these questions of the politics of intellectual work, as you say, like the K through 12. What does it mean to have turned ourselves so inward to scholarly communities and campuses to forget that dimension, which is so essential. Anyone who has had a child or been a child knows this, that they come home with questions or a lack of questions. And
Mhm.
I love that as a reminder that we should have our hands in that. It's been coming up in a lot of these podcasts, actually. So I'm
Mm.
really happy to have your voice on as part of that. And really, just thank you so much for your time. I mean, this has been a really great conversation. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness and the really like importantly challenging questions you brought to the series. Yeah, thank you for that, Michelle.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure to be a part of this.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your day.
All right, you too.
All right. Bye bye.